caste or Dalit studies. When it comes to the minority or Muslim studies, Pasmanda as a political subject is seen as divisive, a subject which breaks the ranks of the Muslim Ummah, which works against the solidarity of the Muslim community, especially in times, very polarizing times. So there is a certain suspicion, both in the academic production and also in terms of the political movement around the Muslim identity. When we come to the anti-caste or Dalit studies, there is a sense that Pasmanda is diluting anti-caste movement, or worse, it is trying to encroach on the Bahujan movement. And there is this sense in the former, there is a denial and erasure in the minority studies or Muslim politics, erasure that Islam doesn't have caste, and so on and so forth. In the domain of Dalit studies, in the domain of Dalit politics, there is a sense that caste is broadly a Hindu phenomenon, right? So the locus of Dalit Muslims or Dalit Christians, for that matter, again, it is seen to be a secondary thing, something they have learned from the Hindus, and with subsequent Islamization or Christianization, they would be casteless or free from caste. That is the context where the Pasmanda as a political subject, it is seeking legitimacy academically and politically. And it operates within the interstices of the Muslim question and the Dalit question. So that is the struggle, the knowledge struggle and also the political struggle in which the Pasmanda as a political subject is engaged in. And how to interpret that, how to read that, one could be obviously the infrastructure argument, but I would suggest it goes much beyond that. And like a number of speakers since yesterday, they have already indicated in the colonial epistemology or colonial historiography. So I also feel that this suspicion can be located there, apart from many other dimensions. So what have I done with this paper? There are three broad discussions. So I start the paper by contextualizing the discussion in some colonial historiography, colonial epistemology, particularly the three assumptions within which the erasure of Muslim caste happens. The first assumption and the first approach, the first move by colonial historiography is making religion as the overarching category to access South Asia. Second is, and I'll quickly run through it, maybe when Harish comments and we could go into more detail. The second important move is to see Hinduism as a tolerant but inegalitarian tradition, and Islam as a fanatic, as a fundamentalist, as an intolerant tradition, but egalitarian tradition. So again, Hinduism as tolerant but inegalitarian, and Islam as fanatic but egalitarian. And this view, it penetrated into the thought process of most of our nationalist thinkers, whether it is Vivekananda, Gandhi, Nehru, Savarkar, of course, and even Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So I would say this formulation is broadly there. It is influencing almost the entirety of nationalist thought. And there are certain consequences of this internalization of this move, which we can have a discussion later. The third is obviously making privileging the ideological aspects of caste at the expense of the political economy. And here, caste being made into an internal moment of Hinduism. And this is what I feel when we say that there's an invention of caste. So this invention, I would interpret that this invention is basically relocating caste within the Hindu framework, rather than what it is actually, which is a South Asian phenomena, which controls sexuality, it controls power, it controls land across South Asia, irrespective of religion and irrespective of regional identities. Uh, and then subsequently, during the nationalist movement, obviously there is a very strong sense of the Hindu-Muslim binary and a very strong uh, emphasis on difference, on cultural, religious difference. So again, if Hindus have caste, how can Muslims have that? Right? Because Muslims have to maintain their boundaries. They have to emphasize their difference from Hinduism. So if caste is a Hindu phenomenon, obviously the strategic view would be an erasure of caste. So like Franklin Faslow in one of his articles, he used the term disinvention of Muslim caste, right? So while in the Hindus, caste is invented in a particular way, it is disinvented among the Muslims in other ways. It is invisibilized. It becomes an illegitimate category when it comes to South Asian Muslims or even most non-Hindus in that sense. So that is the first thought. And this disinvention, it is challenged from the 1990s onward. There was another phase in the 1920s, 30s, which I call the first wave of Pasmanda politics. But it is challenged much more vigorously. The articulation is much more robust from the 1990s onwards because of certain emergent possibilities, especially the three M's, the Mandir, Market, and Mandal moment. So it contests, it opens up the Nehruvian articulation on secularism, on socialism, state planning, and so on and so forth. And that is where a number of new emergent subjectivities are there, and Pasmanda is one of them. There is Ati Pishra, there is Pasmanda, Mahadalit, and so on and so forth. So the legitimacy of all the major categories, OBC, SC, ST, the internal justice question is emerging in a big way, and Pasmanda is one question within the Muslim field, and so on and so forth. So this process of minoritization, which I see as an articulation between two different logics. One is the logic of Muslim as a religio-cultural category, and it also has a genealogy. How Muslim as a hyphenated, as a dispersed field, becomes monolithic in the colonial encounter, and so on and so forth. And second, the minority as a category, which is a statist and juridical category. So these two categories, minority and Muslim, they are articulated together to constitute what I label as the Muslim minority discourse. And there are three key elements to the Muslim minority discourse: identity, security, discussions around communal violence, and equity, questions around reservations, affirmative action, redistributive policies, and so on and so forth. One of the contestation from the Pasmanda vantage point, they suggest that these three critical elements, identity, security, and equity, the discourses around them are monopolized by the Muslim privileged classes, the Ashrafs or the higher caste Muslims. And Pasmanda contest their articulation around all these three categories. So in terms of identity, they would privilege the religious identity, and they would say that all Muslims are one, and so on and so forth. In terms of security, that all Muslims are equally victim of communal violence. In terms of equity, all Muslims should get reservations as a category. So the Pasmanda counter-discourse has challenged all the three. In terms of identity, it says that the so-called mainstream Muslim culture is basically an Ashrafiya culture. It's an upper caste Muslim culture. and it uh, culturally colonizes the Pasmanda life world, and so on and so forth. And there are four distinct markers in the paper. There is some indication. One, a negative value to manual labor. Second, language as a boundary maintenance mechanism, Urdu, Farsi, Arabic, uh, to mark themselves away from the plebeian or the Pasmanda Muslims. Third, obviously, there's this reverence for Sayyids as a class within the Shafi value system. Fourth, this notion of sharafat, which refers to certain modes of piety, demeanor, and so on and so forth. So that on the level of identity, Paswandas are clearly saying that Muslims are not a monolithic community. There are various subjectivities within Muslims. There are Muslim women, there are LGBTQI Muslims, lower caste Muslims, Malayali speaking Muslims, and so on and so forth. It's a dispersed, it's a diverse field. In terms of security, they are saying very clearly that in terms of criminal violence, it is mostly the Pasmanda lower caste Muslims who are affected during criminal violence, while those who are entrepreneurs of this victimhood are largely Ashraf Muslims. If you look at the NGOs and all the academic space, it is Ashrafs that dominate the field. Uh, in terms of equity, they challenge this notion of a reservation for all Muslims, and they want a much more diverse kind of a representation for OBCs, Adivasi Muslims, Dalit Muslims. There are different strategies for that. Uh, yeah, so that is one. So, and I'll just quickly end by saying, so that is when I mapped the Pasmanda counter discourse around these three categories, bring in their narratives, and then connect it to the larger analytical questions being posed on the minority as a concept in general, right? So I think I'll end here. So those are the three broad threads of the discussion, and I look forward to Harish's comment. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Harish, for those insightful comments. Where should I begin with? Okay, so first, on this question of caste within Muslim as a derivative discourse, borrowed discourse, I think I'm actually arguing against that. So, my sense is that if we look at a religious production of Islam in South Asia, theological production, then right from 12th century, 13th century onwards, uh, caste has been legitimized within the Islamic theological production in South Asia. So in that sense, Biradri or caste, it is not an external category which was borrowed. Uh, Rather, the West Asian theological production, which already legitimizes hierarchy and stratification, it articulates very neatly with the South Asian discussion around jati and so on and so forth. Whatever definition or whatever features you apply to the category jati or caste, there are empirical theological reference within Islam and Muslims as well. So my counter question would be, if caste is a Hindu phenomenon, then obviously it is a borrowed discourse, because then Muslims are borrowing some category from the Hindu theological system. But if caste is a sociological concept, uh, then we need to have a different kind of a discussion. What are the things which Muslim experience of caste is not being satisfied as a sociological concept? So, ritual ranking, that is there in Fatwa Jahandari and so on and so forth. Spatial segregation, that is there. endogamy, very strong. Untouchability, yes. Those who converted from erstwhile Dalit locations, they face untouchability. They are Muslim Adivasis. So whatever empirical reference are there in so-called the Hindu discussion of caste, sociological discussion of caste, the same are satisfied by a discussion on Muslim society. If all those conditions are being satisfied, then why this demand for a new innovative category to explain the experience of caste within Islam or South Asian Muslims? So my counter question would be that. Second, I don't agree that Islam is an egalitarian tradition. I see Islam as a religion, as a faith tradition. Just like any other faith tradition, it is dynamic. It is articulated in different space-time contexts, in its relationship with the economy, with the state, and so on and so forth. So whatever high definition of Hinduism one might have, or of Buddhism, or of Christianity, when they engage with the state, for instance, Buddhism in the case of Sri Lanka or Myanmar or in Japan, or when Islam, despite its egalitarianism, when it engages with the feudal state in India during the Mughal time or Afghanistan and so on and so forth, it articulates itself differently, right? And any essential understanding of faith, I don't think it will go into the heart of the matter, right? So, for example, we may have this notion, and that is what I'm challenging, this notion that Hinduism is essentially hierarchical, or is it essentially tolerant? This is something which can be challenged even philosophically, and also with how Hinduism as a category has changed over the last 150 years, especially because of the challenge from Islamic and Christian missionaries, and also from anti-caste resistance. To see Hinduism even now as a disease, right? I'm sensitive to that. Coming from the Dalit location, I'm sensitive to that. That I might share a certain animus about a religion which is seen to be adopted by my oppressors, right? So Christianity is an egalitarian tradition, right? But what about the black responses to Christianity in America, right? They don't see Christianity as an egalitarian tradition, but as a tradition which is monopolized by the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the immediate oppressors. So even if you look at Hinduism, right from Swami Vivekananda to Aurobindo, Gandhi, there is a re-articulation happening, a process of reform which is happening, to the recent 2014 volume on Hindu liberation theology by the Fijian scholar Anand Rambachan. So again, I mean, a lot of water has flown down the Ganges, and faiths are not static categories. Faiths are dynamic. Religions are dynamic, and they change. So Islam, maybe one could have an essential notion that it is egalitarian, but that is not. It has been throughout history in different. It has been very hierarchical. It has been very inegalitarian also. And Hinduism, there could be egalitarian interpretations of Hinduism as well. I know you won't agree with that, but I'm saying Hinduism is not an essentialist religion, just like any other. It evolves and it responds to challenges. And faiths are in itself, their language is metaphorical, allegorical. They are open to new articulations, and so that is one. Uh, Second, on the neoliberal thing and this notion uh, that Pasmanda does not have the resources to deal with it, I think that goes for the broader Bahujan. And also at a global level also, there is a discussion going on. So how to deal with populism, how to deal with the neoliberal economic architecture. So Pasmanda does not need to have a unique articulation about that. It will be a participant in this conversation of how the neoliberal economy affects the subaltern or the oppressed or the marginalized sections. So we are part of that conversation. So, I mean, I've been looking at a lot of discussions, reservations in private sector, and so on and so forth. I have my own take on that. I have my own reading. of how the political economy works, how the neoliberal global economy works. Uh, but again, I mean, this demand from Pasmanda to have a different articulation on the neoliberal economy, I see Pasmanda as a co-participant in the general conversation among the marginalized sections on the impact of the neoliberal economy. So we will add our own bit, uh, but that's it on that question, right? Uh, Majority of Muslims do not assert caste, so again, different. I think that's a what should I say? There's no scholarly study that Muslims don't assert caste in that sense. Uh, I think when you are an insider, as I am, within the Muslim community, I see them talking about caste all the time, right? So it's an insider outsider problem.
Maybe your articles go first there.
Yeah. No, no, no. I mean, you sit with Muslims. There's some discussion on marriage going on. लड़का कौन सी जाति का है, कौन सी बिरादरी का है, लड़की क्या है, अच्छे खानदान के हैं कि नहीं, उर्दू. I mean, so those kinds of discussions they go on आला खानदान. So yes. In terms of political assertion, it's a recent articulation, and so there's always a gap between the articulation, enactment of an identity, and the sedimentation. Uh, and in the particular circumstance where the Pasmanda subject finds herself in, uh, between the Hindu right and the Muslim right, so it is difficult to emerge as a major constituency. But I think it's only a matter of time. The discussions are on. More and more young people, they are identifying with the Pasmanda category. They find that as an interesting lens to understand South Asia, make sense of their own position within the Indian polity and society and so on and so forth. So I think the discourses are circulating. They're finding more traction. We are where we are now. We were not 20 years back. That is why we're having a discussion. So hopefully things will sediment and the movement will emerge and take its rightful place. I mean, let me be much more provocative. If the Pasmanda movement does not succeed, this nation will collapse. Let me be very provocative. Yeah. So, uh, we don't have the time to discuss that, but yeah. Uh, Narratives of the South, obviously, so if you look at the partition, most of the Muslim elite migrated from North India, right? So, because of the migration of North Indian Muslim elite, North Indian Pasmanda, they got some space to articulate their experience. The hegemony was diluted. In South India, Kerala, I'm living in Karnataka right now, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, the hegemony of Ashraf Sayyid Muslims is extremely strong. They have a very dense institutional presence. Their density is very strong. And if the caste question is not emerging there, it is because there's no caste, but rather the Ashraf hegemony is more strong. So, but I know people, they're working on caste in South India, in Lakshadweep, uh, in Kerala, and so on and so forth. And in time, probably those kinds of narratives will also emerge and come. So I'll stop here.
Fraternity.
Huh? Jamaat, yeah. Again, so Jamaat or Samaj. So if you look at Balburli Natarajan's work, he uses the term Samaj. So Jamaat is a parallel term. Bahujan and Pasmanda are parallel terms. So again, your demand for new terms has already been satisfied in terms of semantic difference. But conceptually, I don't see when we share the same experience, the same kind of why to use a new sociological concept when the existing concepts can illuminate the empirical and the lived experience of Pasmanda Muslim. So, I mean, sociologically, I don't see any push philosophically why to use a new category. So, yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
To Professor Khalid Sahab, that how Pasmanda discourse is spreading in society and even is creating a space in academia, because like other discourse, you can take the example of women discourse, Dalit discourse, tribal discourse. Why it's not spreading as fast as the other discourse is taking place? So can you tell me some locknuts? And second thing is that it is connected to that question that you are working. I know you since last 2 decades more than, but currently after talking of Prime Minister Modi about Pasmanda, now a space is created, and then even Pasmanda, those who are working hiddenly, are feel comfortable to talk in public. So is it due to PM? Because my question is just connected to the Sarif Saab, but I'm not referring it so much because I know that since long people are talking about it. So kindly elaborate it and then tell the how far the journey of Pasmanda discourse has come in academia.
Please.
Okay, so first about Mayo Muslims. So, I mean, I haven't worked directly on Mayo Muslims as such, but from whatever discussion I have had with Mayo Muslims, so there is a sense, I mean, there is also a slogan, Mayo Meena Ek Saman, Hindu Ho Ya Musliman, right? So there is a demand from the Mayo Muslims to be included in the scheduled tribe category, right? So, so that is at one level. And because they are in a very backward area, especially in an area where the first Tabligh Jamaat movement also started in 1930s, right? Uh, so, so it's a very interesting area where the Islamization, this experiment of Islamization, started because Mayos were seen to be fuzzy communities, not purely Hindu, not purely Muslim. So it was that kind of a category. So they were in the news for recent many instances of lynching against Mayo Muslim because they were engaged in cattle trade and so on and so forth. And that is one of the arguments that is made by the Pasmanda movement, that this Muslim victimhood or violence against Muslims, it is also very dispersed. Not every Muslim faces the same kind of violence. So if you look at the violence around the imagery of cow or cattle and so on and so forth, it is largely the Qureshi Muslims, the Mayo Muslims, those who are the what are they? Gosis, huh? Gosi Muslims, Gaddi Muslims. They are the ones who are affected. So that is one of the discussions within the Pasmanda movement, right? So in terms of that, I would say Muslims have 700 castes. So there are 700 castes. Every caste has its own narrative about their own self-perception, their own history, and so on and so forth. So we should, whenever we talk about Muslims, we should defer as much as possible this monolithic understanding of Islam and talk hard questions, pose hard questions. Which caste are we talking about? Which region are we talking about? So let us not fall for the easy temptation to go with Muslim. It's very politically convenient for certain sections, but sociologically it is very self-defeating, right? Because the real cases of victimizations, they get occluded, they get hidden because of this all India Muslim category. So that would be my response. I didn't understand your question on Paswanda leadership. So, I mean, the Paswanda, they try to access state resources. They try to chalk out policies that are beneficial for them, scholarship, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, on that count, most of the policies would be the same as the general policies which are demanded by the Bahujans, right? Land reforms, cooperatives, reservations, and so on and so forth. So there is not much difference in terms of the socio-economic policies or a distribution of power and resources and so on and so forth. On PM Modi, so yeah, so PM Modi said, he used the word Pasmanda for the first time in the Hyderabad conclave. Yeah. So I know the genealogy. So, so he said that from the Red Fort also. Uh, but the question is, the motivations, right? So I would say, politics should not exhaust our discussions, and every social movement should have a certain autonomous space, where instead of this discourse being handed from top down from political parties, let it be bottom up. So I'm not really bothered uh, whether it is Rahul Gandhi or Modi or BSP or whatever, because I have a particular understanding of political parties and what political parties do and the kind of negotiations that they have. So I would like to respect all those discourses uh, which are articulated around the authentic experiences, if I can use that term, of our people, especially the marginalized within the Pasmanda, because Pasmanda is also not a monolithic category. There are backward Muslims, there are Dalit Muslims, there are Adivasi Muslims. Even within these categories, there is graded inequality at work. So within the backward class Muslims, the Ansaris, Mansuris, Qurayshis, they would have negotiated democracy better than the other backward Muslims. The position of Dalit Muslims would be comparatively worse off when compared to the backward Muslims, and the Adivasis Muslims are not even talked about at all. So the Gond Muslims, the one Gujars, and the Lakshadweep Adivasis, and so on and so forth. They're not in the map. They're not in the political map. So, so Lakshadweep has a very interesting story in itself, right? So they would have a very strong critique of Malayalam supremacy and Malayalam hegemony there, right? So again, so those are the kind of questions that are not even taken cognizance of because of the categories we use, because of the frameworks that we use. Uh, so so this sense that people are talking about Pasmanda because of Modi's statement, there is some truth to that because of the control he has over media. So whatever he says, obviously, is discussed. If he talks about Rahul Gandhi's hobbies, that would be discussed in the evening or whatever. So in that sense, whatever he utters, that is seen as a gospel truth because of the way things are, right? To put it mildly. But other than that, Paswanda discourse from 1990s, Ali Anwar has been raising. Nitish Kumar raised it earlier. Even Lalu supported demand for the inclusion of Dalit Muslims in the SC category. So there has been discussion, subterranean, sometimes overt, sometimes it has been going on, and we have been moving inch by inch. Uh, I would say thank you, Modi. So, I would have serious questions. It's a question of elite capture. So making an Adivasi woman the president, while every day there are cases of violence in the forest, uh, making Dalit president, and still lynchings against Dalits are there. Talking about Pasmanda outreach, and out of 100 cases, 99 are Pasmanda. So it's a kind of a case of elite capture where the middle class Pasmanda, middle class Dalits, some middle class Adivasis, they get a share in the pie. They get some positions in academia and projects and so on, some political ambition and so on and so forth. But 85% of the Dalits, Bahujans, Pasmanda, who are peasants, who are artisans, unorganized sector workers, it means nothing, frankly. So, नहीं, मैं इसको नहीं मानता कि सिर्फ डर उसकी एक कोई वजह है, बल्कि जो मैंने शुरू में बात की कि okay, so it's not only about fear, right? It is about the categories we use. I think this cannot be resolved only through a social movement unless there is some solid work done on articulation, on the knowledge question itself, right? How we see Islam and South Asia in general. Those are the kinds of questions that are hinted at. There is some serious work that needs to be done. So it is not only a political issue, it is also an epistemic issue, right? How we understand knowledge itself. There are certain questions, for example, it would become a bit of provocative. But just take two questions: 800 years of Muslim rule, and Islam as a religion. Start mapping the views of Gandhi, Nehru, Savarkar, Baba Sahib on that, on these just two questions. Read Pakistan or the Partition of India, read Dr. Ambedkar's comment in Thoughts on Linguistic States, where he says, I'm glad that partition happened because otherwise Muslims would have made the life of Hindus very difficult, and so on and so forth. So you would find a certain closure on the question of Punya Bhumi and Pitra Bhumi. Just read. To convert to Islam or Christianity is denationalizing. So Muslims and Christians are not formally included within the category of nation itself, right? So again, I mean, there's some hard work to be done on the knowledge question, and unless we are able to achieve that, publicize some of these biases, some of these creative misinterpretations, sometimes strategic, unless we challenge that, I think that will not go, right? So the response to that question is it cannot be resolved through politics. It has to be resolved through the knowledge question. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Khalid and Professor Harish, for being